Hello, and welcome to the 8th episode of Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. In this episode, we will discuss progress clocks. So, progress clocks track ongoing effort against an obstacle or the approach of impending trouble. And the important thing to note here is that they track this effort or this approach. They are a representational device that keeps everyone at the table on the same page about what the state of play is. And this means that they don't dictate the course of play. They are just there for everyone to have common ground and common understanding about what is happening. There are 3 levels of complexity of clocks. The first is complex, it's a 4-segment clock. Next, we have more complex, 6 segments, and daunting, 8 segments. These aren't official names for these varieties of clocks. They're just kind of the descriptions that are appended to each of them in the text. And they give you a sense of how complex each one is. The GM ticks clock progress on each of these clocks according to the effect of the action that is happening. And we talked about how much each effect level is worth in terms of ticks when we discussed the action roll. But just to revisit this point, clocks are advanced by effect levels in the following ways. Great effect gives you 3 ticks, standard effect gives you 2 ticks, and limited effect gives you 1 tick. So what this means is if you have the lowest level complex clock, if you get great effect, you still can't fill it entirely in one action. If you get extreme effect, you can. However, more complex clocks than just the complex level, the baseline complexity of 4 segments, can't be fully filled even with extreme effect. So that's something to bear in mind. So to continue discussing the more general concepts of progress clocks, they should not be capable of being filled in one action. Even if they are not complex, they are not necessary. So what this means is that, of course, except in the case of extreme effect, even a 4-segment clock cannot be filled in one action. And that's why the lowest level clock is complex. There's no simple clock, because you don't need a clock if the question is simple, if the matter at hand is simple. You just, as the GM, say, okay, you do the thing, right? You just describe the result of how things play out in the action roll, or whatever you are tracking with your clock. So this really, as a principle, keeps clutter out of the game. So you don't have to make like 2-segment clocks or something, which you could fill with even just a standard effect action, right? That's totally unnecessary, and it would just clutter up your game. All right, so clocks are about obstacles, not methods. This is to say that you should label clocks according to what the obstacle or event that is attached to them is, and not how they progress or how effort is applied towards them. So in more concrete terms, if your clock is about scaling a tower, it should be the tower and not climbing or flying or demolishing or whatever, right? Like, these are different approaches, different actions that the players can decide to undertake for the same obstacle. And the point of this is to keep things flexible and in player control, so the GM isn't dictating player actions when they create the clock. Because as you'll recall, in the action roll, the players dictate the action rating, not the GM. And you don't want to remove that element of the game by narrowing things too much in your clock description. Complex threats can be layered into multiple clocks, which have to be overcome in series. So you'll remember that the most complex clock is 8 segments. However, you can have a number of those in series, or you can even have a 4, a 6, and an 8 in series, as long as they just represent different things, right? So this is similar to like making link tests in the Burning Wheel in a sense. You just have a series of things you need to do in a row in order to overcome the obstacle instead of just doing one thing. So, for example, I want to get into this building. Well, first you got to get through the lock, then you got to take out the guard, and then you got to locate the treasure you're trying to steal, right? Those could all be separate actions with separate clocks attached to them, but to achieve the overall goal, they're all necessary to be done in series. And a clock is for reference, and it does not dictate play, as we discussed already. So to get into the particular types of clocks, there are danger clocks. They announce future danger and how close it is to becoming manifest. So, it could be something like the owner of the house returns, right? So how many ticks until that happens? The most obvious case is the bomb explodes, right? Like it could literally have a timer attached to it, and the danger clock represents how close the timer is to activating the bomb, right? That's like very, very like action movie trope, obvious kind of example. Next, we have racing clocks. These are 2 clocks, and they're labeled with opposed outcomes. Whichever of these fills first dictates the result. So, for example, the PCs escape versus the PCs are cornered. So maybe the PCs are in a chase with the blue coats, and in one case they escape, and in the other case they are cornered. So whenever the PCs do something effective, then you can add to the PC clock, and whenever they fail, you can add to the blue coat clock. So whichever fills first, that dictates the narrative result. You could have this one, which is also from the book, finish a search of the ship versus the ship sinks before the players get off, or the player characters get off. So again, these are 2 opposed outcomes, and according to the success and failure of action rolls, then you end up with one filling or the other filling. So that's what a racing clock is all about. Next, we have mission clocks. These are clocks that represent the time window for completing the score. So they are essentially like danger clocks, but with more extreme consequences. So in other words, I mentioned before, one example of a danger clock would be the owner returns to their home. Well, if that was if they were like magically conscious and they would immediately spot the PCs when they return home, if they were a really significant threat, then maybe the mission would fail as soon as they got home. And in that case, it wouldn't be a danger clock you were talking about that would add some complication to the situation. It would be a mission clock that would indicate that the mission failed or significantly changed when it was completed. So it's really just a matter of degree of consequence between danger clocks and mission clocks. Next, you have Tug-of-War clocks, a clock that can count up and down. This is the only kind of clock that can do this. And it represents a back and forth situation, as you might imagine. So, for example, revolutionary sentiment. So, the government does something infuriating, the clock ticks up, but then they make reforms to placate the opposition, the clock ticks down. Sorry. Another example, a turf war. So, you have 2 gangs at war, right? One of them gets the upper hand, the clock ticks up, and then the other gang makes a comeback, the clock ticks back down if you are tracking which gang is going to take control of the turf. So they're useful for displaying those kinds of balance of power or sort of variable situations. Next, we have long-term projects. So this is something you might recognize from like Apocalypse World, but the way they work in Blaze in the Dark is a little bit more specified. So long-term projects are for dealing with any unusual player goal, including things that circumvent or change elements of the mechanics or setting. They start at 1 8-segment clock, so that's a daunting clock, and can be more depending on the complexity of the task. So really, these are significantly complex projects, right? Like they start at the highest individual level, and you can actually add on more daunting clocks to that count in order to represent just how complex this long-term project is. So, for example, a weapon that does widespread damage by burning trauma. This is from the book. So, in the game, normally the mechanics dictate that once you take trauma, it is permanent. However, if you do a long-term project of significant complexity and the GM's cool with it, then maybe you can create some kind of incredible contraption that actually burns a point or burns a trauma condition in exchange for causing like this huge outbreak of ghosts. That was the example that was in the book. Next, we have faction clocks. These represent the progress of faction goals, and they're advanced usually in the downtime phase. And when you are advancing faction clocks, so maybe every faction has a faction clock, maybe not, but when you are advancing them in the downtime phase, you just tick forward the clocks that are interesting to you as the GM, right? The factions you actually care about, those are the ones you want to focus on. You don't want to bother with every single faction in the city because that's, again, it's just making too much bookkeeping. It's not relevant to the fiction, so don't bother with it. And in fact, it can just get confusing. It can cause a little bit of analysis paralysis or overwhelming information for the players if you were saying like, oh, well, this clock is at 2, this one's at 4, this one's at 6, this other one's at 4, this one's at 8. There's actually 2 clocks here. This one's at 10, and also this other one's at 2. Like, it's just too much information, right? It becomes uninteresting and overwhelming to the players. So instead, you only focus on the clocks of interest to the game, right? And that's your judgment call as a GM to make. And the point of having these faction clocks is to create a dynamic living world with new opportunities and challenges. And really, yeah, it's like the game world moves even when the players don't, right? If factions are moving and scheming and achieving things even outside of the player actions, and affecting the fiction, the sort of larger world fiction, in a way that makes the player characters' lives interesting and provides them with opportunities and challenges, then it's going to make Doskval as a setting pop a lot more than if it is just something that is happening in the neighborhood of the players and the GM is only tracking the factions that are roughly the same tier as the players, right? So GMs and players should discuss how and why PC actions and scores can affect faction clocks. So normally the GM is going to just kind of monitor the clocks and tick them as they think is appropriate in the downtime phase. But like that should also be a discussion, right? It should reflect what kind of jobs the PCs are doing. Did they succeed? Did they fail? What was the fallout, right, of these different jobs? So like if you assassinate the leader of a gang in your area, well, it's probably going to affect the faction clock of that gang, or maybe the gang's rival, right? Think through how the sort of ecology of the city, the social ecology of the city, changes according to what the PCs do and what kind of opportunities and challenges that presents them. Um, so yeah, this is a big part of sort of the downtime phase, and we'll get into that when we get into discussing that more. All right, so we're finished discussing clocks, and in the next episode, we are going to move on to the fortune roll. I'll see you then.